was listening to a podcast the other day by Rob Bell, and it was actually him and his wife, and they were talking about how they were walking down the street the other day, and this car was driving next to them, this Prius, and it was driving at like the speed of an ice cream truck. And the driver in this car was just singing like his life depended on it, like his whole heart. And he pulls up to the stop sign and he stops and he stays there for much too long. And he just keeps singing, and they look over and he's singing Christmas carols. This is a couple days ago. And they were talking about how it wasn't like he was really depressed and trying to improve his mood, so he was singing Christmas carols. And it wasn't like he was genuinely that happy, but it just was like, yep, this is where we are now. Like the world is completely upside down, and you just do whatever you have to do to survive. If that means screaming Christmas carols at the top of your lungs in your car, do it. And that resonated with me because I remember back in April, I was telling my friend that I was on a run on Dorval, so fairly busy street, and salsa music came on in my headphones, and I just started dancing like on the sidewalk, and I was singing, and I just didn't care like if anyone saw me or if there are people who could hear me, because it just feels like we have all these new rules about how to exist in the world. Like you wear a mask and you don't stand too close to people and you can only go certain places, but all of the old rules, just like they don't matter anymore. Like you just sing and dance wherever, and it's just, you do whatever you need to do, because the reality is for the last like 4 or 5 months or however long, we've all been grieving. I don't know if that's like hard to accept, but we've all grieved something, and it feels like we're still grieving. Like every time I talk to someone, there's a loss, whether that be someone in their life getting sick or losing someone or having to throw an awkward birthday party for their kid that just doesn't feel normal. There's just something to grieve. And while things are kind of like opening up and starting to feel more normal, we look at the United States and countries around the world, and I think this reality that things are not going back to normal anytime soon is also sitting in. And so there's just like, there's this grief. And I wonder if any of you hear this voice that says like, you need to be doing better. You shouldn't be so affected by this. You should be back to normal now. I feel like it's so hard to accept that we're grieving, because normally when you grieve, there's like this one thing. You lose someone you love, you lose a job, you know, someone close to you betrays you. And certainly those things have happened to many people over the last couple months. But it's hard to accept that we're grieving right now, because it's not one thing, it's everything. Everything is different. And it's everywhere, and everyone's going through it. It's like in Fresno, the summers when the fires were crazy in California. There was never a fire in Fresno, but there were days that you would walk out of your house and there would be ashes falling from the sky, because it was just, it's in the air. Like, it's just a season of grief. And I know that there are people who feel a little bit like Lieutenant Dan in Forrest Gump. I don't know if you know the scene I'm talking about, but he's in this really intense storm and he's like, bring it on, is this all you got? And there are moments that we might feel like that, like, oh yeah, I got this. And then there are moments where you feel more like Sally in The Nightmare Before Christmas. She's this rag doll that carries around a needle and thread because she's always losing limbs. And maybe you feel like you're carrying around a needle and thread because you just don't know when you're going to fall apart. And you're just trying to keep yourself back together. And normally, we would just distract ourselves from the grief and the pain. We would go have a drink with our friends, we would go shopping, we would watch Netflix, but having a drink with our friends isn't quite the same yet, and we can't shop like we used to. And honestly, some of us have watched every good thing that there is to watch on Netflix, or we're so tired of a screen, we just don't want to look at it anymore. So what do we do with this grief that we're feeling? Last week, we started the series on the Beatitudes. Jesus, he gets up on this mountain and gives this sermon, and the text is in your notes if you want to read it. But his disciples are around him, and and there's all these crowds that are also listening, and he starts teaching, and the first thing that he says is, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." And then he says, "Blessed are those who mourn." And last week I talked about how this word blessed, this Greek word, it's hard to translate, but it's like happy, almost like wonderful news, congratulations. And when you hear it that way, what Jesus is saying sounds very absurd. Like, wonderful news, you're grieving. Grieving is not good news. Grieving and mourning sucks. Does anyone actually, or has anyone actually ever felt blessed while they're grieving? You feel blessed when the heaviness all of a sudden hits you, when you feel like nobody around you understands because they're kind of going at life at a normal pace and they're happy, and you look at them and you think, oh yes, I'm mourning, but I'm the blessed one. No, you don't feel blessed. You feel afraid, like wondering if you'll ever feel normal again. Like, will the process ever end? At the time when Jesus is talking, what he's saying is very countercultural, because he's talking to people who are living under Roman occupation. They've been heavily taxed. They are treated like they are no one, like they have no status, they have no honor, no recognition, and they're waiting for someone to come and liberate them. They are mourning that the world is not the way that it should be. And Jesus says, blessed are those who mourn. It's just as countercultural in our context, because in our context, we don't value mourning. We value happiness. We don't want to mourn. We want to feel good. We want to live comfortable lives. I was talking to someone the other day and they said, Grace, we are good people and we deserve to be happy. The people in our culture who are blessed are the people who have the means to pursue happiness, to accumulate all the things that make you feel good, because happiness is fleeting. And so you have to like keep chasing after it. It's like chasing something that you can't catch, because so much is out of our control. And that's never felt more real than it does right now, when you've lost so many of the things that make you happy. For goodness sakes, we can't even watch sports. The things that we cling to that make us happy are so unpredictable. So in reality, the people who are blessed in our culture are the people who can keep chasing after it. But Jesus didn't say, congratulations, you deserve to be happy and I'm going to give it to you. He said, blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are the Sallys who feel like they're constantly falling apart. Blessed is the man in the Prius who is listening and singing his heart out to Christmas carols, who knows that nothing in the world is the way that it should be. Wonderful news to those of you who feel constant whiplash from the grief, who feel isolated and alone, like no one understands you, who feel afraid that the grief and the suffering is never going to end. Blessed are those people. And he says, for they will be comforted. To be honest, I'm kind of unsatisfied by this statement, by this beatitude. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. I wonder if we really need Jesus to comfort us in our world, in our culture. Like, you can find a good therapist who can comfort you and who can help you process your grief. You can find a friend who will sit with you and cry with you. You can get a pint of ice cream that will comfort you until you eat all of it and you feel really bad that you ate all of it. Is it good news that Jesus comforts us? Is that really what we need to hear? Because even comfort can feel so fleeting. Like, it's there one moment and you feel good and you feel known and you feel seen, and then the next moment you have to face the dark void once again. But what Jesus is getting at here in the statement is so much more than promising to process our grief with us or walk with us in it or mourn with us. He does promise all of those things, but it's even more than that. Jesus always offers us more than what the world can offer us. A therapist can help you process your grief, and I have nothing against therapy. A friend can sit with you and cry with you, and a pint of ice cream can make you feel good for a moment, but they can't redeem your grief. And they can't assure you that it is good. In God's kingdom, grieving over the brokenness of the world is good. It's not wasted. Because it's the mourning that moves us. The mourning moves us. Grief is the gate to newness. It inches us closer to wholeness. It wakes up our imagination. That's what grief does, because it's the end of something and the beginning of something else. And so when there's the end of something, you have to start imagining what could be. Like, what is the new way? That's the way grief works. And the end of something means we get to construct something new. In God's kingdom, when you grieve over the brokenness of the world, it's good because it moves you to action. It inspires your imagination. It helps you think about the way things could be. Jesus also promises you a life without grief. And that's something that your therapist or your friend or your pint of ice cream cannot promise you, that one day there will not be grief. That's part of what Jesus is saying here, is that one day everything will be made right. One day you won't have to mourn over injustice or death because there won't be any. Happiness is circumstantial, it's fleeting. You can keep chasing it, you'll never catch it, but the fullness of the kingdom is coming. It's coming to you, it's coming here. The mourning moves us to action. It also moves our eyes towards the hope of one day, towards the newness. So that even when we are mourning, we're never stuck in despair. Because we know that one day it will end, and God is making all things new. So I want to pause and just give you time to reflect together and just to think about this specific beatitude in light of everything that's going on in the world and the things that I've said. What stands out to you? Is there anything that resonates or any thoughts that are stirring in you as you think about what I just shared and this beatitude? So we're going to split you up into groups just to talk about that. Welcome back, everyone. Does anyone want to share like anything that stood out in their group, their discussion?
Well, we talked about, just I guess verse 4 and verse 3 have somewhat of a similar kind of aspect to them, in that when we mourn, the action of mourning, or includes acknowledgement of loss or hurt or a change of some sort, and so the fact that has happened, it's an honest recognition of an emotion, and so God meets us there when we have honestly had that change, versus if we have experienced loss in our family or in a relationship context, and we just don't have any emotions about that, or are just completely cold, and that really is not a very respectful acknowledgement of what God has of what God maybe was doing, or at least God is in the business of relationships, so it's not, there isn't any acknowledgement of what he's about, what he might be doing. So that, I guess, just that God meets us there when we recognize what he has been doing, type thing.
Thanks, Charles.
We talked a little bit more about the stages of mourning and grief, and just how all of those stages exist, whether it's spending time just accepting those feelings and sitting with them for a bit, or getting to the place where you are angry about it, and then using that anger to move you forward to do something about it. So there's all those different phases and stages. So we talked a little bit more about that and how that applies and how that is relevant to it.
That's great.
Nothing to add to that.
I think similarly, we were talking about just the fact that God is a God who meets you in the journey. Like, blessed are those who are still journeying rather than those who have found their destination. It's easy for us to, in current society, say, blessed are those who have gone through it and are out the other side. But God and God's kingdom are for those who are in the journey or starting out.
Thanks. There's really so much to mourn right now, because I think we are becoming, like, as a culture, more aware that things are not the way that they should be. And we may even be mourning the role that we have played in it, possibly unknowingly, or the ways that we have benefited from that. But what Jesus is saying here is, like, I'm with you, and the things that break your heart also break my heart. And I remember during one specific season of my life, I felt like overwhelmed by just like the amount of pain and suffering, and just very aware that things were not the way that they should be. And the one comfort that I had was that it would not always be this way. And the more that I thought about it and meditated on it and started to imagine with God this new world that he was creating, inviting me into, the more I felt comforted and strength and even joy in the mourning. And so my invitation for you this week is just to sit with God and ask God what he's inviting you to imagine, like in the midst of your mourning and your grief. If you feel like your seams are unraveling and you're losing a limb left and right because things are not the way that they should be and everything feels so heavy, Jesus says, good, like, that's okay. Mourn with me. I'm mourning with you. And so I invite you to sit with God in your grief and your mourning this week and just, ask God what he's inviting you to imagine. Let me say a prayer for us. God, I just ask that you would continue to give us eyes to see places in our world and our culture that are just not right, that are not the way that they should be. And I just pray that we would never feel like accustomed to that would never feel normal, that we would continue to feel the heaviness and the weight of that, and that mourning would lead us to action. And God, I just pray that you would spur our imaginations into a new world. And the moments where the grief feels too heavy, when it feels like there's no way through, and we realize and recognize that we absolutely cannot fix it on our own, God, that we would turn to you and that you would remind us that it won't always be like this. And that wouldn't just be like something that feels far off in the distance, but a reality that's setting in, that's coming here now. We pray these things in your name. Amen.
Yeah.
Drew's going to sing a final song for us. So I just invite you in this time just to turn your eyes and your heart towards Jesus. You know, in the Old Testament, in the first half of the Bible, there are like these laments, these psalms of grief. And then in the New Testament, after the death and resurrection of Jesus, like you don't really get that anymore. Like you get a lot of Paul singing in prison and the church rejoicing even though there's persecution. And I absolutely believe that mourning and grief and lament is part of our journey with Jesus. And there's also joy and comfort in knowing that there's a resurrected life that is coming, that the kingdom is coming. And it can be hard to focus our eyes on that or even to work towards that in the midst of things that are so heavy. And so let me just send you with this blessing. Reunion, may the Spirit of God comfort you in ways that no one else can. And may God give you vision to imagine a new world and strength to pursue it in all of the grief and mourning. I hope that you all have a great week and that God inspires your imagination. Go in peace.